In 1985, President Ronald Reagan placed a wreath at a German military cemetery in tribute to what he described as victims of war, among them 49 members of the Waffen-SS. How did the men who conquered an entire continent for Adolf Hitler end up cast as victims in Western history? The answer is a deception so meticulously constructed it deceived CIA analysts, Hollywood filmmakers, and quite possibly your own high school history teacher. A deception authored by Nazi generals themselves. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now. Turn on notifications and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. In the aftermath of World War II, the victorious Allies confronted the enormous challenge of prosecuting Nazi war criminals. Among those taken prisoner were senior Wehrmacht generals who, rather than facing immediate prosecution, found themselves held together at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. There, under improbable circumstances, these military commanders assembled a coordinated narrative that would distort historical understanding for generations. Within the confines of their detention, generals like Franz Halder, who had served as chief of the German Army General Staff during the war, led the effort to synchronize their accounts. They carefully devised a collective defense designed to shield the Wehrmacht from accusations of institutional guilt, redirecting blame for all war crimes onto the SS and Adolf Hitler personally. This unified approach proved decisive. By the time the Nuremberg trials commenced, these aligned testimonies had been polished into a cohesive defense strategy. Halder, leveraging his authority and personal connections, occupied a central role. He declared in a 1946 sworn affidavit that the German army waged a clean war apart from a handful of minor episodes provoked by Hitler himself. Statements like these were deliberately engineered to draw a hard boundary between the Wehrmacht and the crimes of the SS. This narrative landed on receptive ground in the West, especially in the United States, where escalating Cold War tensions demanded a reassessment of Germany as a prospective ally against Soviet expansion. The general's version of events gained further traction through published writings and media appearances. Heinz Guderian, a pivotal figure and the architect of Germany's Blitzkrieg doctrine, released his memoirs, which reinforced the fiction of a blameless Wehrmacht. These books and other works by former Wehrmacht officers were threaded with carefully selected memories and strategic omissions, all designed to present the regular German military as untouched by the horrors of the Holocaust and the mass killing of civilians. This revision of the historical record reached its emotional crescendo as these accounts collided with the realities of the emerging Cold War. The American public and political establishment, wrestling with the necessity of enlisting Germany as a bulwark against communism, proved more than willing to embrace a sanitized portrait of the Wehrmacht. This acceptance was cemented when, during congressional hearings in 1951, General Omar Bradley, one of the most senior American field commanders of the war, echoed the prevailing view among U.S. officials by rejecting the notion of a uniformly criminal German military. Yet, to fully establish their innocence, the Wehrmacht generals needed more than coordinated stories and sympathetic listeners in Washington. They needed the wider American public and key cultural gatekeepers to adopt and spread their cleaned-up version of the past. This imperative set the stage for their narratives to penetrate American media and education, reshaping how the German military's wartime role was understood for generations afterward. As the Soviet threat intensified, underscored by the Berlin blockade of 1948, West Germany's strategic value to NATO's defensive architecture became impossible to ignore. Amid these mounting Cold War pressures, the U.S. Army found itself in the unusual position of recruiting former Wehrmacht officers to help develop military strategies aimed at the Soviet Union. Among these recruits, Franz Halder was the most prominent. As the former chief of the German General Staff during the opening years of World War II, Halder was commissioned by the U.S. Army Historical Division to produce an exhaustive study of the Eastern Front. The initiative was intended to extract useful intelligence on Soviet military methods, but it also handed these officers an opportunity to quietly rewrite their own wartime records. Halder and his fellow former Wehrmacht officers labored over military analyses that went beyond documenting operational tactics. They subtly recast the German military effort in a more sympathetic light. This reframing portrayed the Wehrmacht as fundamentally apolitical and professionally focused on battlefield strategy, conveniently minimizing the institution's systematic participation in war crimes and the Holocaust. These narratives were eventually absorbed into mainstream scholarship and public discourse, substantially altering how the German military's wartime conduct was perceived. By the mid-1950s, publications and lectures by these officers amplified the clean Wehrmacht message, bolstered by the absence of publicly accessible counter-evidence and the Western Bloc's urgent need to strengthen Germany against communism. The reach of these revised histories hit its emotional peak in 1961, when Halder received the Meritorious Civilian Service Award from the United States, a milestone that confirmed his successful absorption into the Western establishment. The award citation lauded his contributions to understanding the Eastern Front while ignoring his wartime service entirely, thereby completing his metamorphosis from Wehrmacht general to respected Cold War strategist. This moment represented a powerful endorsement of the sanitized Wehrmacht narrative, which continued to circulate amid the geopolitical demands of the era. Equipped with American typewriters and fresh credibility, these generals had skillfully constructed a story that not only absolved them of their roles in the war, but also captivated Hollywood, ensuring the myth's further propagation through popular film and television. This narrative served a dual function. It laundered their historical reputation and furnished the United States with a committed anti-communist partner in the center of Europe, illustrating a profound convergence of history, politics, and propaganda. As the Cold War escalated, Hollywood embraced and recycled storylines that pitted unmistakable heroes against clear-cut villains, a framework that dovetailed neatly with American anti-communist ideology. Enter the 1951 film The Desert Fox, which depicted Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, portrayed by James Mason, as an honorable soldier ensnared in the moral chaos of Nazi Germany. The film drew on the biography by Desmond Young, a British officer who had a brief wartime encounter with Rommel. Young's characterization, shaped in part by that fleeting meeting and by testimonies from German military officers, was instrumental in cementing Rommel's public image as a chivalrous commander who resisted Hitler's tyranny. This film and others like it made a substantial contribution to the clean Wehrmacht myth by enforcing a rigid divide between the Wehrmacht, presented as dutiful professionals, and the SS, cast as the sole carriers of Nazi atrocity. In truth, the boundary was far less distinct. Numerous Wehrmacht units were directly complicit in war crimes, a reality that was downplayed or completely omitted in these cinematic treatments. Historical documents and testimony uncovered later in Soviet archives present a radically different picture, revealing Wehrmacht participation in mass executions of Jews and the systematic brutalization of civilian populations across occupied lands. This distortion of history was deliberate. Multiple former Nazi generals and officers served as advisors on film productions, ensuring portrayals of the German military that would generate public sympathy and even admiration. Their involvement helped weave a sanitized account into the fabric of popular culture, an influence magnified by the international distribution and commercial success of these films. One striking first-hand account that stands in stark contrast to Hollywood's version comes from a private letter penned by a Wehrmacht soldier in 1941. It describes his unit's role in the slaughter of an entire village in Ukraine, carried out under explicit orders from higher command. This testimony, like countless others, was suppressed throughout the Cold War, as both Eastern and Western blocs had strategic reasons to maintain the simplified narrative of unambiguous good versus evil. The effect of films like The Desert Fox on public understanding was immense. They offered an appealing simplicity that buried the complicated and disturbing realities of the conflict. For decades, audiences across the globe celebrated the figure of the principled German officer Rommel, depicted as standing defiantly against Hitler, while authentic evidence of the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes lay sealed in archives or was written off as Soviet propaganda. This cinematic reshaping of the past demonstrates how forcefully film and media can mold collective memory, frequently serving the political imperatives of the present rather than the demands of historical truth. The Wehrmacht's direct role in wartime atrocities is starkly demonstrated by the Barbarossa Decree issued on May 13, 1941. This military order, named for Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, explicitly stripped legal protections from Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, authorizing acts of violence and cruelty on an unprecedented scale. The decree declared that no individual in the occupied territories would be exempt from punishment by German forces, effectively granting the Wehrmacht a license to commit crimes without any threat of legal accountability. The consequences were catastrophic. Historical evidence indicates that approximately 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war were killed under Wehrmacht oversight. The Wehrmacht's complicity in these crimes is further substantiated by numerous eyewitness reports and military communications intercepted and preserved by Allied intelligence. One dispatch from a Wehrmacht unit stationed near Kiev in 1941 matter-of-factly documents the execution of over 30,000 Jewish men, women, and children in a single operation conducted jointly with the SS. The report methodically describes the rounding up of victims, their forced march to killing pits, and the subsequent mass shootings, a horrifying operation that formed part of a wider campaign of terror and annihilation sanctioned and carried out by the Wehrmacht. This involvement extended well beyond actions against Soviet prisoners and civilians. Across occupied Greece, Yugoslavia, and Poland, the Wehrmacht enforced comparable regimes of terror. In the Kragujevac massacre of October 1941, Wehrmacht soldiers executed nearly 2,800 civilians in reprisal for partisan attacks in occupied Yugoslavia. The massacre was carefully organized and methodically carried out, demonstrating the Wehrmacht's active hand in such crimes. A surviving eyewitness, Milos Vasic, a schoolteacher at the time, described how soldiers systematically pulled men and boys from their families and led them away to be killed. His account gives wrenching human dimension to the otherwise impersonal statistics. These were not aberrations, but components of a systematic policy sanctioned by senior military leadership and sustained by a culture of impunity embedded in Nazi military doctrine. The breadth of the Wehrmacht's participation in such violence dismantles the myth of a clean army operating independently of the Nazi regime's ideological machinery. Instead, it exposes a deeply troubling alignment with Hitler's genocidal objectives, carried out with precision and frequently with enthusiasm by regular army units throughout the occupied territories. But it was not only on the Eastern Front where the Wehrmacht revealed its true character. In Greece, Yugoslavia, and Poland, the regular army authored its own doctrine of terror, further entrenching the legacy of violence that defined so much of the Wehrmacht's wartime operations. The Wehrmacht's savagery in Yugoslavia illustrates the full scale of its atrocities conducted under the banner of anti-partisan operations. By 1943, military orders no longer made any distinction between resistance fighters and the general population, resulting in indiscriminate massacres. In Kragujevac, Serbia, in October 1941, German troops killed nearly 2,800 civilians in a single day as punishment for attacks on German forces. This was not an isolated act. Similar mass killings took place across the occupied territories. In Greece, the Distomo massacre of June 1944 left 218 villagers dead at the hands of the Wehrmacht, transforming the ruined village into an enduring symbol of Nazi war crimes in the country. These episodes were elements of a wider strategy that equated guerrilla resistance with collective civilian guilt, thereby rationalizing the industrial-scale killing of non-combatants. In Yugoslavia alone, historians estimate that as many as 1 million civilians perished during the war, the majority killed by Wehrmacht and SS formations. The systematic character of this violence points not to isolated battlefield excess, but to a deliberate policy framework. Archival records from the German military command in Yugoslavia preserve an explicit directive. For every German soldier killed, 100 civilians were to be executed in retaliation. This policy erased entire villages from existence, their inhabitants massacred in cold blood. Scholars like Edward Rudzinski have emphasized that these measures were not rogue operations, but orders issued from the uppermost echelons of German command, calculated to annihilate all opposition through systematic terror. First-hand survivor testimony and captured military documents deepen our grasp of these events. A 1942 report by a German officer described with evident satisfaction the destruction of the village of Lidice in the Czech Republic, where men, women, and children were shot or deported to concentration camps and their homes leveled. The document noted with chilling detachment that the operation was executed with exemplary efficiency and produced a salutary effect on the surrounding area. Such records expose the cold pragmatism underlying Wehrmacht strategy, consistently framed as military necessity. The emotional core of these histories resides in the personal accounts of the survivors. One devastating testimony from a survivor of the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in France, where 642 civilians were massacred in June 1944, recounts how the men were herded into barns that were then set on fire. The women and children were locked inside the village church, which was then detonated. The savagery of these methods, engineered to terrorize and crush any resistance, underscores the Wehrmacht's systematic policy of collective punishment. For 40 years, these numbers and testimonies remained concealed or minimized within the narrative of a clean Wehrmacht. But in 1995, a landmark German exhibition would at last compel the nation to face the reality of its grandfather's war, challenging the sanitized history that had been maintained for decades. This exhibition laid bare the Wehrmacht's direct participation in wartime atrocities, triggering a national reckoning with the past. When the War of Annihilation exhibition opened in Hamburg in 1995, it became a turning point in Germany's historical consciousness. The exhibition displayed over 1,400 photographs and documents, many pulled from the personal albums of Wehrmacht soldiers themselves, which graphically documented their involvement in war crimes across Eastern Europe. This visual evidence demolished the long-standing belief in Wehrmacht innocence, exposing their participation in executions, mass deportations, and the operational machinery of the Holocaust. The exhibition, curated by Hannes Heer, entitled War of Annihilation, Crimes of the Wehrmacht, drew unprecedented attendance. More than 500,000 visitors came through its doors, many of them the children and grandchildren of those same Wehrmacht soldiers. Responses ranged from shock and disbelief to outright rejection. But the sheer weight of evidence on display forced a national dialogue on a subject that much of the country had previously refused to confront. One of the most haunting images showed a German soldier leveling his rifle at a mother clutching her child moments before their execution. This photograph, taken by an anonymous soldier, contradicted every claim that the Wehrmacht was merely a conventional military uninvolved in the Nazi regime's program of extermination. Such images functioned both as historical proof and as a visceral confrontation with the past, pushing many visitors to reassess their own family histories. Eyewitness statements and personal diaries were also featured. One entry from Corporal Max Ladner recounted the methodical shooting of Jewish civilians in Ukraine in 1941, describing it as an act of cleansing and necessary punishment against Jewish subhumans. These individual accounts layered personal stories onto the broader narrative of institutional complicity and collective guilt. Public forums and panel discussions accompanied the exhibition, where historians, survivors, and ordinary citizens debated the meaning of these revelations. One visitor, Karl Schneider, whose father had served in the Wehrmacht, stated in a recorded interview at the exhibition, "I came here searching for traces of my father. Instead, I found a truth I am still struggling to absorb." The exhibition's influence extended far beyond German soil. prompting other nations to reconsider their own wartime roles and responsibilities. It also catalyzed new academic inquiry and contributed to the opening of previously sealed archives, yielding a more complete understanding of the conflict and the Wehrmacht's part in it. As the German public grappled with this disturbing reality, a parallel strand of historical investigation was emerging in Russia. The opening of Soviet archives in the post-Cold War period produced files and records that corroborated the photographic evidence exhibited in Hamburg, revealing still darker dimensions of the Wehrmacht's conduct in Eastern Europe. This cross-referencing of material from opposing sides of the war provided a richer, more layered understanding and confirmed the grim truths the exhibition had brought to light. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 reshaped the global order and simultaneously unlocked a vast repository of records that had been closed to Western researchers for decades. Buried within these files was conclusive proof that shattered the clean Wehrmacht myth. Detailed operational orders, internal correspondence, and eyewitness testimony documenting the Wehrmacht's active involvement in war crimes, including the Holocaust. These archives established that far from standing on the sidelines, many Wehrmacht units cooperated intimately with the SS and took direct part in the killing of Jews, communists, and other targeted populations. One critical document recovered was a 1941 directive from a Wehrmacht unit in Ukraine, ordering soldiers to assist Einsatzgruppen, the infamous SS mobile killing squads responsible for mass shootings of Jews. The order stated explicitly that the Jewish Bolshevik system must be eradicated once and for all. Further confirmation emerged from the personal journals of soldiers and official military dispatches, which contained graphic accounts of mass executions and unambiguous Wehrmacht involvement in these operations. The diary of a Wehrmacht soldier named Helmut Gross described in chilling detail the liquidation of a Jewish ghetto in Belarus, recording without a trace of emotion the systematic killing of men, women, and children. Researchers also recovered photographs taken by Wehrmacht soldiers and mailed home as war souvenirs. These images, stark and horrifying, showed Wehrmacht troops posing triumphantly beside piles of murdered civilians, directly refuting post-war assertions of ignorance and non-participation in such atrocities. These visual records, together with the written documentation, composed a damning portrait of a military institution deeply enmeshed in the Nazi regime's policies of genocide. Survivor testimonies also surfaced with increasing frequency and specificity, buttressed by the newly available archives. A particularly striking account from Elena K., a survivor from a small village near Kyiv, described how German soldiers gathered her family and neighbors before executing them in a nearby forest. She remembered, they were not SS. They were regular soldiers, and they laughed as they herded us like cattle. Confronted with this relentless accumulation of evidence, the narrative of Wehrmacht innocence began to disintegrate. Historians like Richard J. Evans and Anthony Beaver, drawing on these newly accessible resources, published definitive works that laid out the military's complicity in granular detail. Their scholarship drew on the enormous body of recovered documents and personal accounts, constructing a rigorous evidence-based record of the Wehrmacht's role in the horrors of World War II. The impact of these findings was seismic. Public understanding shifted decisively as the academic community and the broader world came to grips with the full scope of the Wehrmacht's participation in Nazi war crimes. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht could no longer survive the weight of proof now exposed for all to examine. With every recovered order and each devastating testimony, the facade assembled by post-war mythmakers and former Nazi generals fell apart, revealing the stark and uncomfortable truths of history. The noble Wehrmacht of Hollywood and Cold War legend has been unmasked as willing participants in genocide. From Halder's prison cell conspiracy to the opened archives, we have watched how power, politics, and propaganda nearly succeeded in erasing the testimony of millions of victims. The clean Wehrmacht myth was not merely a lie about the past, it was a robbery of the future, stripping justice from the dead and truth from the living. Every time we accept the fiction of just following orders, we author the next chapter of atrocity. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more World War II history. Thanks for watching.